Joseph Chamberlain by Enoch Powell. Introduction. When the Liberal Cabinet met on the 26th of March 1886, Gladstone, the Prime Minister, indicated that he intended to lay before the House of Commons a resolution proposing to establish a legislature in Dublin over power dealing with strictly Irish affairs. There immediately leaned forward the president of the local government board, one Joseph Chamberlain, who had been returned at the general election of the previous autumn for the constituency of West Birmingham, one of 7 constituencies into which the city was newly divided, and all of which were won by Liberal candidates. "We are 7, as the saying went. He put 4 questions across the table to the Prime Minister. 1. Was Irish representation at Westminster to cease? 2. Was the power of taxation, including customs and excise, to be given to the Irish legislature? 3. Was the appointment of judges and magistrates to vest in the Irish authority? 4. Was the Irish legislature to have authority in every matter not specifically excluded by the Act constituting it, or only in matters specifically delegated to it by statute? Gladstone, for once, did not refine or prevaricate. He answered yes to every one of the questions. "Then," said Chamberlain, "I resign," whereupon he left the cabinet room at once, accompanied by Trevelyan, the Secretary of State for Scotland. As the door closed behind him, he turned his back upon all that his political life had been for 20 years, over 10 of them in Parliament. His face, and he knew it, was towards his political opponents whom he had denounced and detested, but whom he could not now help but place and maintain in power. It was the watershed of his life. Henceforward, its currents would all flow in the opposite direction and find their way to an ocean undreamed of. It was more than the watershed in one man's career. It was a great geological rift in the pattern of British politics. Its sequels can be traced without any resort to fantasy for a full 2 generations, until the eve, at least, of the Second World War. What was it that could make such a break not merely possible, but, when it came, unavoidable? What is the reconciliation, mental and emotional, between the Chamberlain before and the Chamberlain after? And what was the secret correspondence between the depths that were opened up in the middle walk of this politician's life, and in the new course into which the politics of Victorian Britain turned from that moment? In real life there are no thunderclaps out of skies, where not a cloud is to be discerned. The break in the cabinet room on the 26th of March, 1886, had been foreseeable for a few weeks, and the immediate causes which led to it can be traced back a few months further, to the earliest intimations in the summer of 1885 that Gladstone's mind was fastening upon the settlement of the Irish question as the providentially predestined crown of his career. But though the cloud no bigger than a man's hand can be discovered some 6 months before by careful and retrospective scanning of the horizon, the speed with which the storm itself rose up the sky is still astonishing. The pacification of Ireland at this moment depends, I believe, on the concession to Ireland of the right to govern itself in the matter of its purely domestic business. The time has come to reform altogether the absurd and irritating anachronism known as Dublin Castle. That is the work to which the new Parliament will be called. Those words, spoken at a public meeting in London in June 1885, are not Gladstone's. The speaker was Chamberlain. So close and yet such worlds apart were the right to govern itself in the matter of its purely domestic business, which Chamberlain defined in June 1885 as an essential concession, and the proposal to establish a legislature in Dublin with power over strictly Irish affairs, which in March 1886 blew the Liberal government and the Liberal Party to smithereens, and shifted the track of events forever. To understand why that almost verbal variation was in reality a yawning gulf, and how that yawning gulf was crossed by Gladstone, albeit with the eventual loss and destruction of the old Liberal Party, while Chamberlain, of all people, not only halted on the brink, but marched away resolutely and with growing enthusiasm in the opposite direction, it is necessary to follow Chamberlain from his entry into politics to his first encounter with the government of Ireland under the Act of Union, and then more closely to observe the impact which that encounter made upon his mind when, as a member of Gladstone's cabinet from 1880 to 1885, he came face to face not with the municipal politics of class, but with the elemental politics of nationhood and power. Under the influence of that experience, the aspects of his character and thought which were no more than hinted at in his earlier career became the elements which dominated his later life. Chapter 1. Into Politics. In view of the coming general election, the local Liberal Election Committee held a public dinner one June evening in 1868 at the Plough and Harrow Hotel, which still stands on the Hagley Road in the Edgbaston division of Birmingham. The chairman was Mr. Joseph Chamberlain, aged almost 32, and a widower of 5 years' standing, who managed the patent screw partnership of Nettlefold and Chamberlain, Joseph's father. He was by birth and descent a Londoner, by religion a Unitarian, and he taught Sunday school at the Church of the Messiah half a mile away down Broad Street. Unitarianism is a form of dissent peculiarly elusive to definition, beyond the basic rejection, common to all forms of Unitarianism, of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity and the co-equal Godhead of Christ. But a recent description is much to the purpose. The Unitarian concept of humanism is agnostic about God and emphasizes the human condition and scientific progress. Unitarians have been specially responsive to the spirit of the age in which they live and have been leaders and transmitters of current thought. In the city of Priestley and of Bolton and Watt, represented in Parliament by John Bright since 1857, Mr. Joseph Chamberlain, Unitarian, liberal, philanthropic screwmaker, might rank as typical. He was already being drawn for the first time into political activity through the Education Society, formed to promote the public education at the moment of Lowe's famous dictum, "Educate our masters," on the motto of the Second Reform Act. And no sooner was the election won in November 1868 and Gladstone's government securely installed than two things happened to Chamberlain. He became vice-chairman of the National Education League, which proposed to do for free, universal, non-sectarian, compulsory education what the Anti-Corn Law League was credited with having done for free trade a generation earlier. And he was elected a Birmingham City councillor. It was known that the Liberal government, having disposed of the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in 1869 session, was preparing a great measure on education for the session of 1870. With or without justification, the Education League, and indeed the whole of Nonconformity, took it for granted that the measure would be in line with their objectives. They were dumbfounded when, in March 1870, the Education Minister, W.E. Forster, himself a nonconformist and ex-Quaker, unveiled a bill which fulfilled none of the League's principles, but instead brought into the state and the ratepayer only to supplement the work of the churches, which were given a year's grace to occupy as much educational territory as they could. Chamberlain stepped into the leadership of the instantaneous nationwide repudiation of the bill, and within a fortnight was the spokesman for a confrontation between Gladstone himself and the representatives of every section of nonconformity and many sections of liberalism. The deputation was introduced by George Dixon MP, ex-mayor of Birmingham, and supported by a young MP by the name of Charles Dilke. In the event, the government stood by the bill in virtually its original form, but the result was that the Liberal Party in the House of Commons was hopelessly split, over two-thirds of its members either abstaining or voting against Gladstone. The bill was carried, but only by means of Conservative opposition. A powerful Prime Minister, administration and party had been balked by the stubborn assertion of a principle by an element of their own supporters. On Chamberlain, swept to the forefront of a national agitation almost at the outset of his political life, the impression must have been indelible. The spectacle was a paradigm of the very drama in which he was to play twice more, at the two climaxes of his career. The next time, too, though his role would then be the principal one, the antagonist and tragic hero would again be Gladstone. The statesman and the novice might almost have been rehearsing their parts for 15 years ahead. Perhaps as the drama of politics revolves through its recurrent cycles, men recognise by a kind of instinct the scenes in which their own characters have cast them to play the lead. There is something eerie in the sentence which Chamberlain wrote to George Dixon as he watched the bill being forced through its concluding stages. It, the bill, is a trick to pave the way for the one concession to Ireland which no English Parliament ought to make, and which, when made, will only prepare for that repeal of the Union which I expect must come sooner or later. Did he somehow, the Birmingham Unitarian councillor, wrapped up in free compulsory non-sectarian education, have the heart of the matter in him all the time? What is certain is that in 1870, if not before, Chamberlain must already have thought out his position on Ireland and Home Rule, that it was a Unionist position, and that he must have seen the question as overriding and absorbing those domestic questions with which he was publicly identified. It may be that as far back as 1868, when after the Fenian outrages of 1867 Gladstone declared himself for the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland on the 16th of March, thus making this and the other two Irish matters of land and university, which he linked with it, issues at the election of 1868, Chamberlain had looked ahead further still, and arrived silently at his own position. During the whole remaining period of Gladstone's ministry, to the precipitate dissolution of March 1874, Chamberlain was the driving force of the National Education League in its overt denunciation of a Liberal government which steadily refused to amend the Education Act and remove the aspects that made it uncompromisingly dualist as between the churches and the state as educational agencies. The League declared itself indifferent whether a Tory government sits in the cabinet bench or a Liberal government passing Tory measures, and it did not hesitate in its campaign to attempt to bring about at by-elections the defeat of Liberal candidates who refused to pledge themselves to support its demands. There were times when Chamberlain himself went still further and, once again sounding a leitmotif of actions far in the future, announced that this difference of principle with Gladstone's government was one of those which justify a government's own creators and supporters in destroying it. It was, as he said in a striking article in John Morley's Fortnightly Review in September 1873, quoting J.S. Mill, one of those convictions in which the strength of a man's belief forbids him to make them to the subject of compromise. An important byproduct of all this activity was that it entailed upon Chamberlain discipline and practice of the frequent addressing of large public meetings, and thus ripened and confirmed a style of eloquence, doubtless already his own, which was not perceptibly to vary thereafter. At this stage in his career, without ministerial or collective constraints, he was able to speak free from the necessity of a prepared written text, and the full-scale reporting of the press that day, and long after, fixed and held his unscripted deliverances in the files of the national and local newspapers as effectively as Hansard. His English was clear and vigorous, his periods uncomplicated. He practised the perfection a form of ironically humorous invective which left behind memorable phrases that would become polemics in their own right and would still be passed on with pride and relish from fathers to sons in Birmingham 50 years later. By being enveloped in a nonconformist intensity and earnestness, the Chamberlain vein of humour was saved from degenerating, even when it aimed at individuals, into the flouts and jibes of which Disraeli once accused Lord Salisbury of being a master. The characteristic weakness, perceptible then, and always in Chamberlain's eloquence, was his insensitivity to sudden descent into weak endings, often remarked by conventional phrases or even bathos. If a priest-ridden nation is very much to be pitied, a publican-ridden nation is very much to be despised. That was from Birmingham, speech in 1871. Nobody can say that the alphabet is a sectarian formula. I have never heard that geography leads to atheism, and I have yet to be told that arithmetic is notorious heresy. Newcastle speech, 1872. We should be the meanest and weakest of mortals if we did not pick up the gauntlet. writing for The Spectator in 1873. The years of education schooled Chamberlain in another subject, electoral organisation, for which he and Birmingham were to become famous, and which, through the studies later made of it, notably by Ostrogorski, was to become one of the progenitors of the modern science or pseudoscience of psephology. Under the Education Act of 1870, the members of the local school boards were elected by the cumulative vote, as it was then called, or proportional representation. In Birmingham, the Liberals made the elementary mistake under that system of running too many candidates. In fact, they ran one for each of the 15 seats, and in consequence gained only 6. The next time, in 1873, the Liberals fielded only 8 and returned them all, by the same vote-as-you're-told technique which had enabled them, at the 1868 general election, to return 3 members for a 3-member constituency where each elector had only 2 votes. At that election, their supporters in each ward were drilled to use their votes so as to spread the overall majority over 3 candidates and prevent it from being wasted on 2. For such methods to work, it was necessary to identify supporters and maintain communication and discipline. In the relatively large household franchise electorate, this was the germ of the celebrated caucus organisation, which was supported to have been the technical secret of the electoral hold that Chamberlain had on Birmingham for the rest of his life, and to have been the means of enabling him to cross intact with his Liberal colleagues the perilous divide when he came into it years later. More scientific study of electoral behaviour was tended to suggest that the fame of such organisational methods greatly exceeds the reality, and that the effects are not merely very limited, but occur, if at all, only as an accompaniment to much deeper and subtler influences upon the pattern of voting. However, the myth, whether Chamberlain believed it or not, became part of the popular picture of him, together with his Birmingham home at Highbury and his invariable orchard buttonhole. Certainly he fought his first parliamentary battle with no such advantage. By the time of the snap election of 1874, it happened, as does to some politicians, that he found himself for some reason a habitually popular visiting speaker in a town with which he had no personal connections, Sheffield. So he felt obliged, when the dissolution came, to allow himself to be drafted as the radical challenger to 2 Liberals in 2-member seat. He lost, and was thereby forever reserved for Birmingham. It was at a public meeting in Sheffield on New Year's Day 1874 that a voice in the crowd called out, "What about Home Rule for Ireland?" By a fortunate chance, Chamberlain's answer was reported. "Home Rule for Ireland is worthy of a separate and lengthened discussion. I can only say now, generally, that if Mr. Butt may be considered as a true exponent of the views of the Home Rulers, I am in favour of the system he advocates. And I believe that, also, the extension of the system of local government would be of the greatest advantage both to England and Ireland. It is only candid and fair to add that I am not in favour of any system which would go further than this, and which would separate the imperial relation between the 2 countries." The reference to Mr. Butt's system is highly significant. Isaac Butt, 1813-79 MP for Harwich, 1852, Youghal, 1852-65, and Limerick from 1871-79, appears to have invented the term Home Rule and was leader of the Home Rule Party from 1871. His system was federal, as set forth in his book Home Government for Ireland, Irish Federation, Its Meaning, 1870. It is thus clear that at least as early as 1873 Chamberlain had reached the position of linking the Irish question with federalism and regarding a federal framework as the only acceptable condition of Home Rule. Chapter 2. Mayor of Birmingham. It was in November 1873, shortly before the general election and his defeat at Sheffield, that Chamberlain was chosen mayor by the Liberal majority on the Birmingham Town Council. He almost immediately afterwards sold out his share in the screw business, which in later years became Guest, Keene and Nettlefold, in order at 37 to devote himself exclusively thenceforth to the public life. He plunged at once into a programme of municipal development, of which the 3 outstanding and characteristic features in 3 successive years were the municipalisation of gas, the municipalisation of water, and the municipalisation of redevelopment land in the centre of the town. In 1873, Birmingham was backward, not to say barbaric, in comparison with other and smaller towns and cities, its physical appearance and its sanitary and social provisions. Other cities were before Birmingham the municipalisation of public services. What was special about Chamberlain's onslaught was the dedication to managerial efficiency and to profitability. He advocated the civic acquisition of the right to supply gas, not to spread the cost of supply across users and non-users, and not merely to give a civic impetus to improved and extended supply, but by efficiency to enhance the profit and lower the price, while endowing Birmingham with a revenue-producing asset. The economies of scale successfully exploited in making screws were to be applied to the making and distribution of gas, with public capital at purely nominal risk. The mayor ran gas and water as he had run Chamberlain and Nettlefold. In fact, he offered, in the course of debate, to rent the gas undertaking from the corporation at £20,000 a year, and guaranteed to make a personal fortune out of it by the time he was 50. Chamberlain derived the case for municipalisation from the concept of monopoly. All monopolies which are sustained in any way by the state, the qualification of being sustained by the state would suggest itself naturally to a non-statutory monopolist in screw-making, ought to be in the hands of the representatives of the people, by whom they should be administered, and to whom their profits should go. But there were ulterior motives, because local government was a good thing in its own right. I am inclined to increase the duties and powers of local authorities, and would do everything in my power to constitute the real local parliaments supreme in their special jurisdiction, a formulation not without overtones of federalism, though there is nothing to suggest that the use of the word parliament implied legislative powers. When the turn of water came, and the water company was bought out by the means of private act, a new turn was added to the theory, the mayor securing the passage through the council of a resolution that, whereas there should be a profit made on the gas undertaking, the water should never be a source of profit. All profit should go in reduction of the price of water. I have found no evidence that Chamberlain examined the questions: 1. Why water, but not lighting and heating, should be provided at minimum price? 2. Why profit-making was beneficial to the supply of gas, but not of water? 3. On what principles the price of supply by a statutory monopoly should be fixed? This last a question not answered by the reply that neither a loss nor a profit is to be made. During the same parliamentary session of 1875 in which Birmingham secured the private bill to municipalise the water supply, the Home Secretary Richard Cross and the President of the Local Government Board, John Sclater Booth, in Disraeli's government, passed the Artisans Dwelling Act, which gave the municipalities power to acquire compulsorily and to clear and redevelop areas of unsanitary housing, and by which they were empowered to retain the freehold, but not without specific authority to build houses themselves. Chamberlain was an enthusiast for the principle of the Act, and his cooperation with the two Tory ministers in shaping it, and their goodwill towards his other municipal enterprises in Birmingham, perhaps raised his mind for the first time the unspoken question whether he could not somehow, and in some matters, work with and through the Conservative Party. At all events, as soon as the bill was law in July 1875, Birmingham put forward an improvement scheme under it, which was, as subsequently extended, would redevelop a great triangle of squalid housing between the two railway stations, New Street and Snow Hill, by driving through it a great new commercial thoroughfare to be known as Corporation Street. It was estimated that, after allowing for enhanced rateable value and the commercial leases that would be obtained, the annual burden on the rates would be only about £12,000 a year, and that when the debt was cleared and the leases reverted in the 20th century, the corporation would be an incalculably wealthy landowner. Light, like gas and water, it was a commercial enterprise of what Chamberlain called sagacious audacity. The private bill under which the financial and physical operations were carried out during the decade to 1885 was passed in August 1876. Before that, on 17th of June, Chamberlain had entered the House of Commons, and his mayoralty ended in November, though he continued an alderman. But from that day to his Corporation Street, far more than the fountain statue erected in 1880 in Chamberlain Square next to Town Hall was to be his monument in the city with which his name was already synonymous. There were in the area of the improvement scheme 3,744 houses occupied by 16,596 persons. Despite the title and purpose of the Enabling Act, therefore, and although Chamberlain in speech after speech dilated upon the horrific slum conditions, and prayed in the aid, the moral as well as sanitary blessing of removing them, the scheme had little to do with the improvement of housing. It was all very well for him to say that, unless we improve some of these dwellings off the face of creation, the labour of the minister of religion, the schoolmaster and philanthropist will be thrown away, or that, by the work we are undertaking, we hope to wrest from the fell grasp of disease and misery and crime whole populations which would be otherwise abandoned to them. In fact, other less spectacular, but more effective forces did the work. In 1883, some anxiety was manifested as to how far the convenience of the poorer classes had been affected by the removal of dwellings from the crowded streets in the centre of the town, and also as to whether sufficient provisions existed for the families who had been obliged to seek new places of abode. The Committee of Investigation set up in consequence by the Council reported that there is adequate dwelling house accommodation for the artisan and labouring classes within the borough, 8% of all houses being unlet, and the percentage being highest in the cheapest houses, the weekly rents of which were as low as 2 shillings 6pence. Overcrowding did not exist to any appreciable extent, and with some exceptions, the dwelling house accommodation was found to be in a fairly sanitary condition. This explains why Corporation had without success endeavoured to let sites for artisans' dwelling. There be so many dwellings of this kind unlet, owing to overbuilding. After he ceased to be mayor, Chamberlain was not quite finished with municipalisation. He persuaded himself that a municipal monopoly of the liquor trade would be a profitable and practicable method of countering insobriety, and before the end of 1876 he was organising a nationwide campaign for municipal public houses, based in part upon arrangements he had observed during a tour in Sweden. But the end of it was a private member's motion, thrown out in March 1877. By then, Chamberlain's mind had made, at 40, the transition from municipal to national politics. The transition coincided with other changes. In February 1875, he became a widower for the second time. His second marriage to Florence Kenrick, a cousin of his first wife Harriet Kenrick, to whom he was married 1861-3, had been exactly conterminous with his political life up to that time. Widowhood left him with a son, Austin, by his first wife, and another, Neville, by his second. Through the next 13 tumultuous years of national politics, and across a turning point of his career, he was to live the existence of a single man. Whether or not partly in consequence of his bereavement, the former Unitarian Sunday School teacher seems at this period, and lastingly to have admitted, at least to himself, that he was no longer a believer. It was within a year of his wife's death, and in reference to it, that he wrote the unmistakable though carefully guarded words in a letter to John Morley, the acknowledged and militarily agnostic editor of the Fortnightly, with whom he had become fast friends in the course of the Education League in operations in 1873. Does not the presence of this great grief in your household impress you with the cruelty of this life as you and I are compelled to see it? It is a hideous business, and our conception of its end and meaning is thoroughly unsatisfactory. We may be right, I fear we are, and I refuse to try and buy comfort by forcing myself into insincere conviction, but still I thoroughly abhor the result at which I arrived, and I think it a grievous misfortune to have been born into such a destiny. The religious was not the only mental change occurring. When, immediately after his election to Parliament, Chamberlain went down with an attack of what was at last correctly diagnosed as gout, he made the obligatory jokes about the statesman's disease, and added It is very painful, but will no doubt endear me to the Tories, to gain whose affection is now the chief object of my life. It was, of course, 3 parts ironical, but not wholly, nor was the prophetic element surely altogether unconscious. There was more behind the words and the thought than the camaraderie with Disraeli's ministers which he had developed over municipal enterprise, or the bitter convictions that, if the Liberal Party under Gladstone was incapable of radical policies, less harm would come from a period of frankly conservative government. There was aspects of Disraeli's administration, aspects that would be classified later as imperialist, which he positively approved. The purchase of the Suez Canal shares by Disraeli, he writes again to Morley, was wise and plucky, and more than would have been expected of the Liberals if they had been in office, and it had paid dividends at once, in Abyssinia and in Egypt. For though it may or may not be desirable that we should have a finger in the Egyptian pie, we have got it. So those were the private thoughts of the radical mayor of Birmingham at the time he was plotting and piloting the Corporation Street improvement scheme through the council and the private bill committees. Chapter 3. In Parliament. It was June 1876 when the mayor of Birmingham found his way into the 1874 Parliament at a by-election caused by the voluntary retirement of his old ally in the education battle, George Dixon. As was still not abnormal at that period, especially at by-elections, there was no contest. Before the parliamentary recess had got his maiden speech over on an amendment to the 1870 Act, which first brought him into national politics. When the House rose in August, Disraeli left it for another place as Lord Beaconsfield. More immediately important for Chamberlain, Gladstone made it his unexpected and unheralded return from retirement, like some meteor re-entering the solar system, with his outburst against those Turkish atrocities in Bulgaria, which were the prelude to the outbreak of the Russo-Turkish War in April 1877. Within 6 months, the new member for Birmingham had furnished the Liberal Party with a nationwide organisation, and its returned prophet and inspirer with the greatest political meeting of his life. When the next session of Parliament opened, Chamberlain, with astonishing precocity and precision, took 2 large initiatives. In Parliament he stood forth, along with Charles Dilke, but otherwise virtually alone, as the defender and supporter of Gladstone's anti-Turkish stance in a house and a country where anti-Russian sentiment and bellicosity were sweeping all before them. When Russia went to war in April, Gladstone insisted upon debating 5 anti-Turkish and pro-Russian resolutions, to the extreme embarrassment of the Liberal Party and his successor in its leadership, Lord Hartington. Only the Birmingham radical had his heart in the fight and cheered on the grand old man, until, to his puzzlement, Gladstone suddenly withdrew, the tactical why and wherefore remaining obscure to however gifted a parliamentary novice who had not yet learned to distinguish the shadow from the substance in House of Commons battles. Meanwhile, in February 1877, Chamberlain had carried out a stroke long premeditated. The National Education League was dissolved, and its machinery and headquarters in Birmingham placed at the disposal of a proposed new National Federation of Liberal Associations, who were summoned to an inaugural conference on 31st of May at Bingley Hall, Birmingham, to be addressed as guest speaker by, of all people, Gladstone himself, for whom willingness to gratify an ardent young paladin was reinforced by a perception of the inherent possibilities for mischief and for power. The timing worked out perfectly. From the parliamentary battle over his resolutions, Gladstone proceeded to receive apotheosis from allegedly the largest audience ever gathered together to hear a man speak, which Chamberlain, elected its president, hailed from the chair as a real liberal parliament, outside the imperial legislature, and, unlike it, elected by universal suffrage. For a man who had not yet been a year in Parliament, it was a staggering achievement. The Liberal caucus, a word but not a thing borrowed from America, was in business circumstances were not visible. when Frankenstein would have to wrestle for political survival against his creature. The temperature of Gladstone's agitation fluctuated with the course of the Russian war on Turkey during the following 12 months. Chamberlain's enthusiasm sobered. Past experience makes me very little sanguine of any real strength or union against the moves towards war with Russia being secured. These he wrote in February 1877. He had been parted even with Dilke over the issue, but was all the closer in Gladstone's councils, with whom in April 1877 he was dining and having long conversations every other day. The end of it all came suddenly when the diplomacy of Beaconsfield and Salisbury was triumphantly sealed by the Peace with Honour at Berlin in July. That act was over, but another had opened before the end of 1878, when the colonial embarrassments in India and South Africa, which reversed the fortunes of the Conservative government. Gladstone and the Radicals were furnished with fresh and better supplies of the same sort of anti-jingo ammunition, which Chamberlain exploited in platform speeches throughout the country for the remaining life of the Parliament. But in the session of February to August 1879, Chamberlain found himself in new and unexpected company. In February 1879, Dilke brought him into contact with Parnell, elected in 1875 for Meath, in whose hands the parliamentary struggle for Home Rule was passing from its originator, the ageing and gentlemanly Isaac Butt, but for whom the harsh tactics necessary to coerce the attention of Parliament held little attraction. Dilke and Chamberlain found Parnell of the opinion that if the Liberals brought in a good land bill, they would assure the goodwill of the Irish people and party for some years at least, and might deal a fatal blow to the Home Rule movement. If then the radical wing of the party could get a good Irish land bill inscribed on the Liberal banners, the rewards might be large. There were two subjects bulking large in the 1879 session, which found Chamberlain and Parnell gaining for one another the cautious respect that grows up between members of widely separated political origins who find themselves fighting on the same side, especially against the feeling of their own parties. The disaster of Isandlwana, where the Zulus destroyed the British force on New Year's Day 1879, and the first of the series of imperial humiliations that turned the glorious summer of Berlin into the winter of discontent into which Disraeli's administration drew to its close. The conduct of the policy of the Zulu War became thereby one of the staple topics of the 1879 session. Chamberlain took a major part in support of Dilke's in the censure of the government for retaining Sir Bartle Frere as High Commissioner after his ultimatum had provoked the unhappy war. His central argument was the unlimited consequence of the principle of seeking scientific frontiers for the empire and declining to tolerate strong neighbours. We are undoubtedly the greatest colonizing nation on the face of the earth. Surely it is time for us to lay down clearly and plainly, to define accurately, the spirit and temper in which we are going to discharge the vast obligations which we have undertaken. Everywhere we hold territories acquired in the first instance by aggression and conquest, everywhere with a reputation, which I am sure was not calculated to secure the love of our neighbours, we have come into contact with tribes more or less savage, more or less independent, more or less powerful, and everywhere our colonists call upon us to exert the whole force of this country to secure the proper subordination of those native tribes to the handful of Englishmen who claim the right to be supported by the whole power of the British Empire. I ask the House, where is this policy to stop? It seems to me, if it goes on as it has commenced, we shall have very shortly the whole responsibility of government of South Africa on our hands, as well as of vast areas of country in other parts of the world. It was another of those premonitions, this time of the Jameson raid, with which his earlier years were studded. By now Parnell was engaged in the campaign of obstruction, which he had developed almost since his entry into the House. It may have been as grist to that mill as much as for any other reason that he supported Chamberlain, as the Zulu War proceeded, in calling for safeguards against reprisals upon the Zulus for Isandlwana. When you make war against a savage nation, it follows that your soldiers will also become more or less savage. and when they see their own countrymen massacred, it is almost impossible to restrain them. Therefore, Her Majesty's government should be careful not to enter into a war with a savage people unless compelled by the most urgent necessity to do so. The operations of the Home Rule members, like those of obstructionists before and since, had in previous sessions already fastened upon the Army Discipline Acts. In the course of utilising them, they brought and kept before the attention of Parliament the question of flogging in the army, and were one of the elements of the House which made that among the principal topics of the second half of the session of 1879 in the context of the Permanent Army Discipline Bill. In this they were joined by Chamberlain, who, in supporting abolition in preference to limitation, referred on 19th of June to obstruction and paid marked compliment to Parnell. If there is any threat to the House, or out of it, of anything like obstruction, we must not lose sight of the fact that government only made reasonable concessions after 4 days' discussion. In fact, we can get nothing from the ministry except what is commonly called obstruction. Therefore the ministry has no right to complain if opposition is carried further than previously we have been accustomed to carry it. The friends of humanity and the friends of the British Army owe a great debt of gratitude to Mr. Parnell for standing up alone against this system of flogging when I myself and other members had not got the courage of their opinions. The honourable member has opposed flogging in the Mutiny Bill, but unsuccessfully. He has opposed it unsuccessfully in the Prisons Bill. But now he raises it again, and I hope that his efforts will be crowned with success. Eventually Chamberlain and other radicals drove and goaded their reluctant front bench under Hartington to the point, after weeks of debate, of forcing them to propose an official motion on 17th of July 1879 to abolish flogging for military offences. The motion was defeated by the government, but Chamberlain saw advantage for the Liberals in having joined the Irish in their parliamentary tactics. Though he had earlier foreseen that Irish would compel the House of Commons to defend itself against them by unwelcome procedural weapons, he was sure we are making a great mistake by helping to create a feeling against the Irish on obstruction, which will all tell in favour of the Tories. They will pose as the friends of the order, and get all advantages of our denunciations of obstruction. The author Justin McCarthy, whose first parliamentary session was 1879, dictated a quarter of a century later that Sir Charles Dilke and Mr. Chamberlain boldly and vigorously maintained Parnell in his policy of obstruction when it only professed to concern itself with Irish national questions. They identified themselves so closely with his Irish policy that it became a familiar joke in the House of Commons to describe Dilke and Chamberlain as the Attorney General and Solicitor General of the Home Rule Party. Again and again I heard Mr. Chamberlain express his entire approval of the obstructive policy adopted by Parnell and declare that it was only by way which Parnell could compel the House of Commons to give a hearing to Irish claims. Dilke regarded Home Rule as an essential part of a federal system. Therefore, even if the Irish people had not been themselves awakened by the necessity for a Home Rule legislature in Ireland, Dilke would have been in favour of urging them on and the advantages of such an arrangement. Chamberlain was not so convinced as an advocate of the general system of Home Rule as Dilke, but he was always emphatic in his declarations that if the large majority of the Irish people desired Home Rule, the desire should be granted to them by the Imperial Parliament. It seems likely that McCarthy's recollection had been greatly warmed and exaggerated by the lapse of time and his own aspirations. Nevertheless, if there was even a fraction of this relationship in 1879, it could have been one consideration which commended Chamberlain for elevation the next year. The government knew better than anyone out of office how rapidly nationalist Ireland was becoming intractable. When Disraeli suddenly dissolved in March 1880, almost immediately after the opening of the new session, his letter to the Duke of Marlborough, which was the equivalent of an election manifesto, devoted itself almost exclusively to Ireland and the Union, and made this the preeminent issue. The dissolution was taking place now because the measures respecting the state of Ireland, the relief bills to deal with the failure of the harvest, were on the statute book. Despite the care, however, of the administration for the improvement of Ireland and the content of our fellow countrymen in that island, A danger in its ultimate results scarcely less disastrous than pestilence and famine distracts that country. A portion of its population is endeavouring to sever the constitutional tie which unites it to Great Britain in that bond which has favoured the power and prosperity of both. It is hoped that all men of light and leading will resist this destructive doctrine. There are some who challenge the expediency of the imperial character of this realm. Having attempted and failed to enfeeble our colonies by their policy of decomposition, they may perhaps now recognize in the disintegration of the United Kingdom a mode which will not only accomplish but precipitate their purpose. The theme of the Union was thus linked with the theme of the Empire. The government was aware, as the public and opposition as yet were not, that the mounting threat of obstruction in Parliament and violent agitation in Ireland. Gladstone denounced Disraeli's words as baseless and terrifying insinuations, and the Irish and English constituencies were exhorted by the Home Rule organisations to vote against Benjamin Disraeli as you would vote against the mortal enemy of your country and your race. In the event, the Liberals were returned in the early days of April 1880 by a majority of more than 50 over Conservatives and Irish Home Rule combined. Chapter 4. Mr. Gladstone's Government, 1880 to 1885.